And so today, I would like to introduce to you our speaker, who is Janet Wiselius. He is an associate professor of philosophy at Augustana campus. And let me note that Janet is a recipient of the 2020 Rutherford Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. The title of her talk today is Fishballs, Promoting Student Engagement and a Safe Atmosphere for Remote Teaching. And so with that, take it away, Janet.
Thank you so much, James. As James already told you, I'm a philosopher. So I teach philosophy, and it's typical for philosophy professors. In our classes, we depend a lot on conversations as a learning strategy. And so when we moved to online learning, I was really worried that I would lose this very important teaching and learning strategy. Particularly in the discipline of philosophy, students have to know both what historical and contemporary figures think about a particular topic, say, for example, the nature of time, but they also have to know what the possible positions are on a topic. So if you're talking about the nature of knowledge, they have to know that what empiricism is and what rationalism is and constructivism, etc. And part of the way philosophers teach students is to have them introspect on what they think. And that introspection is a path for them to start initially just listing, but then analyzing all the possible positions one could take on a particular topic. In addition to that, the vast majority of philosophers, we really want our students to not just know the possible positions, but we want them to come to their own position on a particular issue and then self-consciously know why or what their reasons are for the position that they hold. So there are a number of teaching strategies that are used to accomplish these learning objectives. And of course, not all of them work for all students all of the time, but talking through your position in conversation with others, identifying the strength and weaknesses of a position and identifying what, if any, modifications would ameliorate weaknesses or strengthen it, hearing and seriously considering the different positions and perspectives of others is a key and a very powerful learning strategy. And the evidence shows, this research shows, that it promotes deep learning. And in fact, most philosophers think of their discipline as an enormous 2,500-year conversation. For myself, I actually teach students that when they're reading a historical philosopher and when they are themselves writing a paper, they're participating in this historical and ongoing conversation. So that's all to say, I think you can see now why I was so anxious about losing the in-class conversation in my courses. This is really how students think and learn and work through philosophical concepts and theories. So I started looking around. What could I do to replace this? And this is the problem for me. The problem was how to structure a conversation in a Zoom setting with 40 plus students. And in fact, in one class, I had more than 55 students. So how to structure a conversation in a Zoom setting with a not insignificant number of students, some of whom never have their camera on for reasons of privacy or problems with technology. And in fact, I'll just add, because I teach at the Augustana campus, a good many of our students are either rural or they're in the north. And a lot of them have limited bandwidth. So I knew that there were going to be those technology problems and that they wouldn't, for example, be able to have their camera on a good part of the time. So, of course, the first thing I did was I thought about using small groups of breakout rooms, because that kind of mimics the way I would teach if I was teaching face-to-face. So in face-to-face teaching, for example, this is what I would do. I would often put students into small groups to discuss an issue or a concept or a problem. But in those instances, like when I was teaching face-to-face, those small groups would have been preceded by a period of the students writing a short reflective piece, what's called ink shedding. And then the small groups, the way I'd get a conversation started was that students would share and discuss in their small groups that what they had just written. But that was going to be a problem because I wasn't going to spend part of my Zoom time saying, okay, we'll just take 10 minutes here and you folks sit down and write, shed some ink about a particular problem. So I couldn't reproduce that part of face-to-face teaching. And it's really important, I know from experience, to do that, because small group discussions, or large group discussions for that matter, they don't work if we don't first give students some time to reflect on a manageable question, right? And like I said, I had previously managed that when I was teaching face-to-face by first having students write on some very specific question or questions, and then actually reading each other's piece of reflective writing in a small group. Like I said, and I know this from experience, but you can pretty much intuit as well that you're not going to get a good discussion going by asking students, like, get into small groups and discuss what the meaning of life is, or, what is the nature of truth. You have to give them something, you have to give them priming questions that they can first reflect on and then talk about. The other thing is, I also really worried about my own ability to switch between groups in a virtual environment, right? In a face-to-face class, I would just walk around the class and join groups, but that's much harder to do when you've sent groups into a breakout room and it's more intrusive. And then last but not least, I knew that it was already going to be hard enough to create a community among the students in an online course. And I wasn't sure that putting them in small groups was going to help that. So when I was looking around thinking, okay, what other strategies have other people tried when they've taught online, I came across fishbowl conversations. Some of you might know what that is and some of you don't, but I'll explain it. But what I did was I modified the strategy of fishbowl conversations for my own purposes, which is common. So a fishbowl conversation is a strategy for having a discussion in a large group. It was not developed for an online environment. It was actually developed for when you have a really, really large group of people. And this is how a fishbowl works. Classically, there are 5 or 6 participants who are physically set up in a series of chairs, or often in a circle, but there are 5 or 6 participants who are physically set up in the center of the room. And these 5 or 6 people, that's the fishbowl. They're the people in the fishbowl. They have a conversation, and the rest of the class sits around them, often in a circle, but it doesn't have to be. They can just be sitting behind them. But they sit around the 5 or 6 people in the fishbowl, listening to those 5 or 6 people in the fishbowl have a conversation. There are, even in the classical version of the strategy, there are various modifications. Like, for example, every 15 minutes, the people in the fishbowl, the people in the center, the ones having the out loud conversation, they switch seats with some people on the outer circle listening. So in other words, every 15 minutes or so, the 5 or 6 people in the fishbowl change places. Or another very common modification is that sometimes in the fishbowl, there's one open chair where someone from outside the fishbowl can come in and occupy that chair by asking a question, and then they leave and it's open again until somebody else from outside the fishbowl comes in and joins that conversation, asks a question, and then leaves. So I think you can see how that fishbowl strategy enables a conversation to happen when there's a very, very large group of people. So what I decided was I was going to use parts of this strategy for my classes. although I still just called it a fishbowl. So here's what I did. I taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I did this, by the way, in all 6 classes that I taught this past year. But I was teaching on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and every Tuesday we'd have a synchronous traditional class where I would talk about the material for the week. So basically I would have a little informal lecture. And in those Tuesdays, students were always free to interrupt to ask me questions. And I often as well left some time at the end of those Tuesday classes for discussion if students wanted it or if they wanted to ask me questions. But that's how I ran the Tuesday classes. But Thursdays were all Thursdays. They were always a fishbowl class. And I made it very clear that no one student had to talk. So in other words, a student could go through the entire course never talking during a fishbowl session if that's what they wanted to do. But I also made it clear they were all expected to attend and to listen to the conversation. And I just want to, as an aside here, stop and say, this is the biggest part of this exercise, the fishbowl conversation. This is the biggest part that made it safe for students. It was safe because students could get a lot of the benefit of a conversation without being put on the spot in an online environment that was really unpredictable for a lot of students. And I'm just going to remind you again that I had so many students tell me that their cameras were broken, they were using old computers, right? Or their microphones didn't work, or that their internet was unstable. So given that there was so much unpredictable in their online environment, the fact that I was never going to put them on the spot, and in fact, they didn't have to actually say anything, made it really safe for them. So, of course, all of you people are teachers and you're thinking, okay, so if nobody had to talk, how are you going to get this? How are you going to get this going? Well, let me say that I'll be upfront about this. This was also, it was the safest part for students, and it was the most risky for me as a teacher, which is, what if no one wanted to talk? Well, I also set it up so there were lots of ways to make it easy for students to talk. And I'll tell you what my strategies are or were for that, because it was risky, because I told them no one had to talk, but I did a couple of things. I gave all the students leading and let's call them priming questions to think about between Tuesday's class and the Thursday fishbowl. So when I was teaching face-to-face, I would often get them to do a period of ink shedding, this reflective writing. And what I did, especially in the beginning of the course, when I was trying to get them used to this and feeling comfortable, I would give them a series of, I called them reading questions, but at the end of Tuesday's class, I would say, reread the reading for this week that you had already read for Tuesday's class, reread it. And here are some 3 or 4 reading questions that you should think about as you're getting ready for Thursday's class, and you have to hand them in to me. And I would read them. I would occasionally make comments, but basically that was just low stakes writing to get them to actually do the reading and writing. So it didn't require a lot of grading on my part. So I gave them an incentive to do it, but it wasn't worth a great deal of marks. I just wanted them to, I wanted to prime the pump, as it were. Then the other thing that I did, part of what made it work for me, was in each course that I taught this past year, I had at least one, but often a couple more. I had at least one student that I knew from a previous course, so from the year before. And what I did was I asked them in an aside, right? I asked them if they would start on Thursday with a question. And often I even, I gave them a couple, if they didn't have a question of their own, I gave them a couple of suggestions for questions. And often they were completely, they were dead simple questions, things like, Kant calls his epistemology constructivist, but why does he call it that? Isn't it really just a combination of empiricism and rationalism, right? So there were really, really easy, simple questions. So that's what I did. And then what I did was I told students that they didn't have to talk. All they had to do was attend and listen. And then I told the students that this is how I described the fishbowl classes to them. I said, this is how our fishbowls on Thursdays are going to work. There would be no inner circle, but rather we'd have a conversation where no one was required to speak, but anyone could speak or post to the chat. And if you spoke or if you posted to the chat, you were in the fishbowl then. And in fact, I also told them, because I wanted to let them know that my expectations were that we would have a conversation, even though no one was required to talk. I said, if there were too many students who wanted to speak in any one fishbowl, then I would happily schedule more fishbowls and assign an inner circle. But in fact, that never happened. And I didn't think it would, but I wanted to set things up and make clear to students, not that I was expecting this to fail, but that I was actually expecting this to work. So I began the first fishbowls in the beginning of the courses. I began by opening up the floor to questions. And as I said, I'd given all the students priming questions beforehand, right? Like, what does Kant take from empiricism and what does Kant take from rationalism, but rejects, et cetera, et cetera. I also, in the very beginning of the course, when the students and I were getting used to fishbowls and getting used to each other, like I said, I asked some students beforehand to begin asking questions. And I also, even if I didn't know the student, I also made a point of bringing up questions from the Tuesdays class, if there had been any. You know, for example, even if I didn't know the student, I'd say, Sarah, you asked on Tuesday, why do we think time is linear and not circular as some Eastern civilizations do? Are you still convinced that time moves only in one direction? And Sarah could answer, or what I would often say, how many of you think what Sarah does? Or how many of you are confused by this? So it was risky. And it was always a balancing act between giving students, those who had already shown their comfort in asking questions. You know, in the Tuesdays class, it was always a balancing act between giving those students a chance to be in the center of the fishbowl and doing the out loud conversation, and letting the other students just listen, but making it welcoming enough that they could break into the conversation. I also kept an eye on the chat and read those questions and comments that came in the chat, reading them out loud. And I would often invite students who had posted to the chat. I'd invite them to turn on their mics and speak to their comments, which they often did if they were able to. Also, I'll tell you that for me, keeping an eye on the chat was the hardest part. And eventually what I wound up doing was that I just asked arbitrarily one student in the class to keep an eye on the chat and to interrupt me when there was a comment and read it out loud. I only did this in one class because it worked for that particular class, but I got fishbowls started, not so much by asking questions, but by beginning each session, each beginning part of the fishbowl with a thought experiment. Like for those of you who are familiar with it, like Schrodinger's cat. Is a cat dead or alive? What do you think this means, et cetera, et cetera. And philosophy has a lot of those thought experiments. So I did that in one class. So you want to know how it went? I have to say, after the first 2 weeks, which means really the first two fishbowls, right? Because you only have two Thursdays in 2 weeks. The fishbowls actually exceeded my expectations. More students participated beyond the first few that I, in the beginning kind of asked them to ask questions. Other students jumped in. The majority of students, it's true, never did ask questions or offer answers. Although many of them, I would say about half of them, sent questions and comments to the chat. And in fact, that's when I realized, that's where I found out that so many of our students had computers with either broken mics or broken cameras or low bandwidth, but they still participated through the chat. Other students who never spoke out loud and sometimes didn't participate in the chat, but they would send me emails between classes asking me to bring up certain issues or questions in the fishbowls. So that's part of the reason why I say fishbowls exceeded my expectations. But more than that, how do I know that they went so well? Well, they mention them often in their writing assignments. They'll say, in such and such fishbowl, we learned such and such. But beyond that, it's because in my USRIs, surprisingly, they were extremely positive. I mean, comments about the fishbowls. Not every student mentioned them, but many students said how valuable they found fishbowls and how it was, now I'm quoting them, how it was the safest they had ever felt in a class discussion. And what was really interesting for me was how students seemed to view themselves as participants in the discussion, even if they themselves never said anything. They still felt that they were part of the discussion. And in fact, I think that might have to do with the thought experiments too, right? Because even if a student never said anything, that student was still following along by doing the thought experiments. And what I think was most telling was in the USRIs, there was not a single negative comment about the fishbowls. And of course, as we've all seen, there's usually at least one negative comment about an aspect of a course that was otherwise positive. But the fishbowls were often mentioned and always mentioned positively. So I'm going to give you also, I'm going to quote one comment from a USRI, and not to say what a good teacher I am, but it's so interesting what the student, I have no idea who it was, said about fishbowls. So thank you, she said, he said, thank you for teaching, et cetera, et cetera. One time, my mother was home when your fishbowl was on, and she absolutely loved this style of teaching and the way you set up the lesson. She said it made her want to teach again. My older brother, who's a philosophy nerd, also came upstairs every class to hear your fishbowls, and we all discussed what we thought afterwards. And then, hope you have a great summer. Two things about that. One is, in this online environment, we never know who's listening to our classes. But also, here is someone who I get the impression the student never talked during a fishbowl, but very much felt part of the conversation. So, in conclusion, what did I learn from all this? Like I said, it was a risky strategy, at least for me. And I always had a backup plan. And the backup plan was simple, which is if the fishbowls had failed completely, I always had another set of remarks prepared for those fishbowl Thursdays in case it really fell flat. The other thing that I learned was in the beginning, I really concentrated on getting students to ask questions rather than offer their own positions. So in a way, it wasn't a conversation in the classical sense, because at first they were just asking questions. And I also had a set of, like I said, I always had a set of questions. I think that was key. I always had a set of questions prepared beforehand that would, prime the pump, get them thinking about things. So, questions like, have you ever wondered if you'd be the same person if your consciousness and your memories, et cetera, were transferred into another body? And then I'd ask students, well, how many of you, and I would just get them to, use the emojis or the reactions. How many of you say yes? How many of you say no? And then I'd say, just open-endedly, I'd ask, well, for those of you who said yes, why did you say yes? And for those of you who said no, why did you say no? In other words, I had a lot of questions for them. But eventually, as I said, by the end of the course, I didn't need to ask questions. And often when I asked other students to respond, instead of me answering the question, I say, well, what is it? How do other people, what do you think Sarah's saying? Or do you agree? Students often did respond to each other. So like I said, there was some risk involved here, but it was mostly risk on my part and not on the part of the students, which I think made it very safe for them, even if they did offer a remark. Am I going to keep fishbowls when I go back to face-to-face teaching? I don't know. I mean, I know that what I did face-to-face, getting them to write and then break into small groups, worked really well. But I think that I will probably keep an element of it. And maybe what I will try when we go back face-to-face, I might try a classical fishbowl where we actually physically, there are 5 students in the center who participate and then they move in and out of the fishbowl. I think, though, the biggest thing that I learned from this exercise was that students actually don't need to talk out loud in order to feel like they're part of the conversation. And that is, to me, a counterintuitive result. But I know that when I go back to face-to-face teaching, I'm going to feel a whole lot more comfortable about some students not talking very much and just letting that be. So thank you very much.